There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes with power. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being surrounded by people you can't trust. Of having advisors, generals, family members, allies, all close to you, all necessary, and trusting none of them. This was Napoleon's reality. Not occasionally, not in moments of crisis, but constantly, systematically, as a fundamental operating principle of how he lived and ruled. He built an empire, commanded armies, reorganized nations, changed the course of European history, and he did it while trusting almost no one. Not his brothers, whom he made kings, not his marshals who won his battles, not his wives, not his closest advisors, not the people who owed everything to him. This wasn't paranoia, or at least it wasn't just paranoia. It was strategy, deliberate, calculated, a way of maintaining control in a world where control was everything and trust could be fatal. But here's the question. Was he right? Did his distrust protect him? Did it make him stronger, more effective, more capable of achieving what he achieved? Or did it isolate him, limit him, ultimately contribute to his downfall? Because there's a pattern here, a trajectory. Napoleon rose further and faster than almost anyone in history, and he fell just as dramatically. And throughout both the rise and the fall, this refusal to trust remained constant. It shaped his relationships, his decisions, his victories and his defeats. It made him powerful, and it made him alone, completely alone even at the height of his power, especially at the height of his power. So the question isn't just about Napoleon. It's about power itself, about control, about whether you can build something lasting without trust, whether you can lead without believing in the people you lead, whether isolation is the price of absolute authority, or whether it's the thing that makes absolute authority impossible to sustain. This is a story about what happens when someone brilliant, ambitious, and extraordinarily capable decides that trust is weakness, that relying on others is risk, that the only person you can count on is yourself. It's about what that choice costs, what it enables, and what it ultimately destroys. Napoleon never trusted anyone, and that fact, that single psychological reality, shaped everything that followed. Everything he built, everything he lost, everything he became. This is why. To understand why Napoleon didn't trust anyone, you have to understand the world that formed him. France in the 1790s wasn't just unstable. It was a place where trust could get you killed, where yesterday's ally was today's enemy, where the person sitting next to you at dinner might be the one who denounced you to the Committee of Public Safety by morning. The revolution had destroyed the old rules. The monarchy was gone. The aristocracy was gone. The church's power was broken. And what replaced them wasn't order. It was chaos. Violent, unpredictable chaos where survival depended on reading situations correctly, on knowing who had power this week, on understanding that loyalty was temporary and alliances were tactical. During the Terror, 16,000 people were officially executed. Thousands more died in prison or were killed by mobs. And the victims weren't just aristocrats. They were revolutionaries who had supported the wrong faction. Moderates who weren't radical enough, radicals who became inconvenient. People were denounced by neighbors, by colleagues, by family members. This was the world Napoleon came of age in. As a young artillery officer, he watched the political ground shift constantly. He saw leaders rise and fall within months. He saw people he knew executed. He saw that the revolutionaries who talked most about fraternity and equality were often the first to betray each other when it served their interests. He learned early. Institutions couldn't be trusted because they were temporary. Ideologies couldn't be trusted because they changed with whoever held power. People couldn't be trusted because their loyalty lasted only as long as their interests aligned with yours. And he was good at navigating this. Exceptionally good. He understood that in a world without stable rules, you made your own stability. You didn't wait for others to protect you. You didn't rely on their promises. You controlled what you could control and assumed everything else was hostile or unreliable. This wasn't paranoia. It was realism. Appropriate realism for the environment he was in. The people who trusted too easily didn't survive. The ones who believed in permanent alliances got betrayed. The ones who thought friendship or shared ideals would protect them ended up on scaffolds. Napoleon survived. More than survived. He advanced. And he advanced precisely because he understood this. Because he never confused tactical cooperation with actual trust. Because he always assumed that the person across from him had their own agenda and would act on it the moment it benefited them. By the time he rose to power, this wasn't just a survival strategy anymore. It was his fundamental model of how the world worked, how all relationships worked, how power worked. And he wasn't wrong. Not entirely. Because the world he inhabited was exactly as dangerous as he believed it to be. The coup that brought him to power in 1799 succeeded partly because he trusted no one with the full plan. The consolidation of his authority worked because he assumed everyone around him would betray him if given the chance, so he structured things so they couldn't. The question isn't whether his distrust was justified in that moment. Clearly was. The question is whether he ever learned to distinguish between the chaos of revolutionary France and the different kinds of challenges that came with actually ruling. Whether he understood that the skills that help you survive a revolution might not be the same skills you need to maintain an empire. Or whether, once you've learned that trust is dangerous, you can never unlearn it. Even when the world changes. Even when the danger shifts. Even when isolation becomes the greater risk. Napoleon didn't just distrust people. He built systems around that distrust. Made it operational. Turned it into a method of control that defined how he governed, how he commanded, and how he maintained power. The central principle was simple. Never let anyone have enough information or authority to act independently. Never create a situation where you had to rely on someone else's judgment or loyalty. Control everything that mattered. Verify everything you couldn't directly control. In military terms, this meant he made all significant tactical decisions himself. His marshals commanded armies, yes, but they commanded them according to his plans, following his orders, executing his vision. He didn't delegate strategy. He didn't empower his generals to improvise or adapt beyond narrow parameters. This worked brilliantly when he was present, when he could see the battlefield, when he could assess situations in real time and adjust. His ability to read a battle, to spot opportunities, to coordinate complex maneuvers across multiple units, it was extraordinary. And because he trusted only himself to make those calls, he made them faster and better than opponents who relied on committee decisions or delegated authority. But it also meant his armies became extensions of his own decision-making. They functioned optimally only when he was there to direct them. The marshals were executors, not independent commanders. Competent executors. Skilled executors. But not trained or trusted to think strategically on their own. In governance, the pattern was the same. He centralized administration. Created systems where information flowed up to him and decisions flowed down from him. Prefects reported directly to Paris. To him, ministers had authority only within strict boundaries. Anyone who showed too much independence got replaced. He read everything, reviewed everything, made decisions on matters that most rulers would have delegated to subordinates. Not because he enjoyed administrative work, but because he believed that the moment you stopped paying attention, people would pursue their own agendas, would make decisions that served them rather than you. And he was probably right. In a system built on his personal authority rather than institutional legitimacy, people's loyalty was to him personally. And personal loyalty is contingent, temporary, based on what you can provide. The moment you can't provide it anymore, the loyalty evaporates. So he made sure he was always necessary. Always the only person who had the complete picture. Always the only one who could make the crucial decisions. He made himself indispensable by ensuring no one else could do what he did. He also created parallel systems of verification, multiple sources of information on the same thing, so he could cross-check. So no single person could control what he knew. The diplomatic service reported on foreign governments. But so did military intelligence. And so did the secret police, each giving him different perspectives, each potentially catching what the others missed or distorted. His personal staff kept files on everyone important, their backgrounds, their connections, their financial situations, their vulnerabilities, not necessarily to use against them, but to know, to understand their motivations, to predict their behavior. This wasn't paranoia. It was risk management. In a world where people's loyalty couldn't be assumed, you needed information. You needed leverage. You needed to know more about them than they knew about you. The cost was enormous effort. Managing everything yourself is exhausting. It's also limiting. There's only so much one person can actually oversee, no matter how capable. At some point, the empire becomes too large, the challenges too complex, the number of decisions required too great. But Napoleon never adjusted the system, never learned to delegate meaningfully, never built institutions that could function without him, because that would have required trusting people, trusting them not just to follow orders but to use judgment, to act in his interests even when he wasn't watching. And he couldn't do that, not because the people around him were untrustworthy, though some certainly were, but because his entire model of how power worked was based on the assumption that everyone acts in their own interest, that loyalty is always conditional, that the moment you give someone real authority, they start building their own power base. So he kept all real authority for himself, made all important decisions himself, verified everything himself. And it worked. For a while. It worked spectacularly. Until the empire became too large to manage that way. Until the challenges became too complex for one person to handle. Until the battles happened simultaneously on too many fronts for him to be present at all of them. At which point, the system that had been his greatest strength became his greatest vulnerability. Because he had never trained anyone to think like him, had never built institutions that could function in his absence, had never created a structure that could survive without him at the center. He had built an empire, but he had built it in a way that only he could run, and that meant it could only last as long as he did. Here's what's strange about Napoleon's relationship with power. He had more of it than almost anyone in European history, and he never felt secure in it. He controlled France absolutely, commanded armies that conquered most of Europe, crowned himself emperor, made his brothers kings, reorganized legal systems, redrew maps, changed the political structure of an entire continent. And through all of it, he operated like someone who could lose everything at any moment, who assumed betrayal was inevitable, who trusted nothing and no one, who constantly checked, verified, controlled, managed every detail because the moment he stopped, it would all collapse. This wasn't humility. It wasn't caution. It was something deeper, a fundamental inability to believe that his position was stable, that his authority was accepted, that the people around him had reasons to support him beyond immediate self-interest. Part of this was rational. His legitimacy was questionable. He wasn't a king by birth. He was a general who had seized power in a coup. His authority rested on success, on winning, on delivering results. The moment he stopped delivering, the foundation disappeared. But there's a difference between understanding that intellectually and living in that space psychologically. Napoleon never made the transition from revolutionary opportunist to legitimate ruler. Never internalized that at some point, institutions matter more than the individual who leads them. That power can be stable even when it's not personally controlled minute by minute. He made himself emperor, created a court, established rituals and protocols, built all the external markers of traditional monarchy. but he never believed in them, never trusted that the symbols and systems would hold without him constantly maintaining them through direct action. And this created a specific kind of isolation. He was surrounded by people constantly: advisors, ministers, generals, family, court officials. But he was alone in a way that mattered, because he couldn't share the burden, couldn't genuinely consult, couldn't trust anyone else's judgment on things that mattered. When he asked for advice, it wasn't real consultation. It was testing, checking what people would say, seeing if their answers matched his own thinking or revealed agendas he needed to account for. The decision was already made. The advice was just data, information about the advisors rather than input into the decision. His marriage to Josephine is revealing here. He loved her, genuinely loved her in his way, but he never trusted her, monitored her constantly, read her correspondence, kept track of her movements, assumed she was unfaithful, which she was early on, and never really forgave it, never really moved past it. The love remained, but so did the surveillance. When he divorced her to marry Marie Louise of Austria, it was a political calculation. He needed an heir, needed a connection to legitimate European royalty. But even that marriage, that strategic alliance, he approached with the same fundamental distrust. Marie Louise was a means to an end, not a partner, not someone to confide in, just another piece in the system he was managing. His brothers, whom he made kings, were another example. He gave them thrones, enormous power and status, but he never trusted them to rule independently, constantly interfered, overruled their decisions, replaced them when they showed too much autonomy. The kingdoms existed to serve his empire. Their authority was conditional, revocable, never really theirs. Even with his most capable marshals, Davout, who was completely loyal, Berthier, who was indispensable, Lens, who was perhaps the closest thing he had to a friend, even with them there was a limit, a boundary. They were tools, brilliant tools, necessary tools, but tools, not partners, not equals, not people whose judgment he trusted on the same level as his own. And this is where the isolation becomes profound, because power without trust means power without rest. It means never being able to step back, never being able to say, I've built something solid enough that I can rely on it, never being able to delegate in a meaningful way, never being able to genuinely collaborate. Everything rested on him. His judgment, his decisions, his constant attention. And that's not sustainable. Not physically, not psychologically, not practically. There's a limit to how much one person can manage, how many decisions one person can make well, how long someone can operate at that level of intensity without making mistakes, without burning out, without the system becoming too complex for centralized control. Napoleon reached that limit, not all at once, but gradually, as the empire expanded, as the challenges multiplied, as the wars continued year after year, as the coalition against him grew stronger and more coordinated. And when he reached that limit, there was no backup system, no one he had trained to think strategically, no institutions that could function without him. No network of trusted advisors who could share the burden. Just him, alone, at the center of an empire too large for one person to run, making all the decisions, carrying all the weight, trusting no one, because he had never learned how, because the world that formed him taught him that trust was weakness, that relying on others was risk, that the only safe position was total control. And total control, it turns out, has limits. Physical limits, cognitive limits, strategic limits. You can build something extraordinary through pure force of will and individual brilliance. But you can't sustain it that way. Not indefinitely. Not when the challenges are existential and the enemies are numerous and the decisions need to be made faster than one person can make them. This was Napoleon's paradox. He built an empire through distrust. through refusing to delegate real authority, through keeping everything under his personal control. And that same approach guaranteed the empire couldn't last, couldn't adapt, couldn't survive the inevitable moment when he couldn't be everywhere at once. Power without confidence, authority without trust, control without collaboration. It worked until it didn't, and when it stopped working, there was nothing underneath to catch the fall. If you look at Napoleon's personal relationships, you see the same pattern repeated. Control substituting for trust.
Surveillance replacing intimacy.
Transactions instead of genuine connection. Start with his family. He elevated them enormously, made his brothers kings, his sisters princesses and queens, gave them wealth, status, power, but he never treated them as equals, never consulted them as partners. They were extensions of his authority, tools for managing the empire. And when they showed independence, when they tried to rule their kingdoms according to their own judgment, he treated it as betrayal. Joseph, his older brother, was made king of Naples, then king of Spain. Lucien, the third brother, was offered multiple thrones and refused them because the conditions were too controlling. Louis was made king of Holland and abdicated because Napoleon wouldn't let him actually govern. Jerome got Westphalia. All of them lived under constant supervision, constant interference, constant reminders that their authority was borrowed, conditional, revocable. This wasn't just political, it was personal. Family dinners became occasions for criticism, for Napoleon to remind them that everything they had came from him, that their failures reflected on him, that their independence was insubordination. The emotional dynamic wasn't brotherly. It was hierarchical, transactional, based on utility rather than affection. His mother, Letizia, was one of the few people who could speak to him bluntly, who maintained some independence, but even she kept distance, saved money secretly, prepared for his inevitable fall. She never trusted that his success would last, and he knew it, and it created a gulf. She loved him, but she didn't believe in the permanence of what he had built, and he couldn't forgive that lack of faith, even as he proved her caution justified. Then there's Josephine, the relationship everyone thinks of as romantic, as passionate, and it was in its way, but it was also deeply unequal, deeply controlling. He loved her, wrote her letters that were genuinely emotional, needed her in ways that made him vulnerable, but he never trusted her. Early in their marriage, while he was on campaign, she was unfaithful. He found out, and he never fully moved past it. For the rest of their relationship, even after she stopped the affairs, even after she became completely devoted to maintaining his position, he monitored her. Read her mail, kept track of her movements, used informants to know what she was doing when he wasn't there. The love remained, the need remained, but trust never developed. Or it developed and then broke, and once broken couldn't be repaired. Every affectionate gesture coexisted with surveillance. Every moment of intimacy existed alongside the assumption that she would betray him if given the opportunity and the motive. When he divorced her, for political reasons, to marry into Austrian royalty and secure an heir, he provided for her generously, made sure she was comfortable, visited her occasionally, but the decision itself was transactional. She had served her purpose. Now he needed something else, someone else. The relationship, despite the genuine emotion, was ultimately instrumental. Marie-Louise, his second wife, never even got the illusion of partnership. She was an alliance made flesh, a connection to Habsburg legitimacy, a womb for producing heirs. He was polite to her, correct, but there was no intimacy, no real sharing. She was part of the system, another piece he had positioned to serve his larger purposes. And she proved him right in a way. When he fell, when he was exiled to Elba, she didn't follow, didn't fight for him, returned to her family, to Austria, eventually took a lover and lived out her life separate from the drama of his final act. She had played her role in the marriage exactly as transactionally as he had designed it. And when the transaction no longer served her interests, she stopped participating. His closest working relationships followed similar patterns. Talleyrand, his foreign minister, was brilliantly capable, indispensable for years, and Napoleon never trusted him, kept him under surveillance, eventually dismissed him, and Talleyrand, proving the suspicion at least partly justified, worked against him, helped orchestrate his downfall, not because of personal animosity, but because Talleyrand served France as an institution, and at some point, Napoleon's interests and France's interests diverged. Fouché, his police minister, was another example, incredibly effective at maintaining internal security, at managing the spy networks, controlling dissent, and Napoleon kept him on despite never trusting him. Despite knowing that Fouché kept files on everyone, including Napoleon himself. Despite knowing that Fouché's loyalty was conditional and tactical. Why keep him? Because he was useful. Because the alternative was having someone less capable in that position. Because Napoleon's system required competent executors, even if they couldn't be trusted. The distrust was priced in, managed, accounted for through parallel systems of verification and control. But this meant that all his relationships, even the most important ones, had a ceiling, a limit to how deep they could go, how genuine they could become. He could never fully relax, never fully share, never fully depend on anyone for anything that mattered. And the people around him knew it, felt it, adjusted to it. They learned to operate in a system where loyalty was rewarded but trust was never granted, where competence was valued but independence was punished, where proximity to power came with constant surveillance and zero security. Some adapted and thrived, learned to work within the constraints, made their peace with being instruments rather than partners. Others eventually broke, left when they could, turned against him when they couldn't leave but couldn't continue serving. What none of them could do was change the fundamental dynamic, because that dynamic came from Napoleon's core understanding of how relationships work, of what people are, of what you can and cannot rely on. He believed people acted in their own interest, that loyalty lasted exactly as long as incentives aligned, that affection, family bonds, shared history, all of it was secondary to self-interest. And he built his relationships accordingly, as transactional arrangements, as systems of mutual utility, as controlled environments where he maintained the upper hand through information and authority. And maybe he was right. Maybe in the world he inhabited, with the kind of power he wielded, genuine trust was impossible. Maybe the people around him would have betrayed him if given the chance. Maybe his suspicion was justified and his control was necessary. But the cost was real. The isolation was profound. And the relationships that might have sustained him through the difficult years, that might have provided genuine counsel, real support, authentic connection, never developed. Because they couldn't develop in a system built on control rather than confidence. He died surrounded by a handful of loyalists on St. Helena, people who had followed him into exile. But even then, even in defeat, even in the final isolation of that remote island, the relationships were defined by hierarchy, by his authority, diminished but maintained, by the fundamental inability to be anything other than Napoleon, to be simply human, to be vulnerable without it being strategic, to trust without verification. The empire fell, the glory ended, the power dissolved, and what remained was a man who had never learned to build anything that didn't rest entirely on his own shoulders, who had never developed the ability to share burdens, to genuinely collaborate, to trust. It's a particular kind of poverty, to have had everything, to have controlled an empire, to have commanded armies and shaped history, and to have remained, through all of it, fundamentally alone. There are specific moments where you can see Napoleon's distrust stop being an advantage and become a liability. where the same instincts that helped him rise became obstacles to sustaining what he had built. Russia, 1812, is the most obvious example. The invasion was a disaster. 600,000 men entered Russia. Fewer than 100,000 returned. It broke the Grande Armée, shattered the myth of French invincibility, gave the coalition against him the opening they needed. And one of the reasons it failed was his inability to delegate, to trust his marshals to make tactical decisions appropriate to the situation they were facing. He had always made the crucial calls himself, always been present at the decisive battles, always been the one who saw the whole field and coordinated the movements. But Russia was too vast, the army too spread out, the logistics too complex. He couldn't be everywhere, couldn't see everything, couldn't make every important decision in real time. And his marshals, trained to execute his plans rather than develop their own, struggled when they had to operate independently. At Borodino, the bloodiest single day of battle in the Napoleonic Wars, he had opportunities to break the Russian army decisively. His marshals saw them, recommended bold moves, asked for permission to commit the Imperial Guard, the reserve force that could have turned the battle into a rout. He refused, wouldn't risk the guard, wouldn't trust the judgment of the commanders on the scene, maintained control, made the conservative choice, and the Russians retreated in relatively good order, lived to fight another day, eventually drew him deeper into the Russian winter, into the trap that destroyed his army. Would trusting his marshals have changed the outcome? Maybe not. The strategic logic of the Russian campaign was flawed from the start. But the refusal to delegate, the insistence on maintaining personal control even when the situation made that impossible, it mattered. It cost opportunities. It limited options. Spain was another example. The Peninsula War, the guerrilla conflict that drained French resources for years, happened partly because Napoleon tried to manage it remotely, made his brother Joseph king but wouldn't let him actually rule, sent contradictory orders, interfered constantly, created a situation where no one had clear authority or could make consistent decisions. The French forces in Spain were substantial, capable, led by experienced marshals. But they operated in a confused command structure where everyone reported to Paris, to Napoleon, and he tried to orchestrate everything from hundreds of miles away, while also fighting wars on other fronts, while also managing the entire empire. Couldn't work. The information arrived too slowly. The situation changed faster than he could respond. The local commanders needed autonomy to adapt to guerrilla tactics, but he had never trained them to think independently, had never built a system where initiative was rewarded, where people made decisions because they understood the strategic intent rather than because they were following specific orders. By 1813, when the coalition had regrouped and was pressing from multiple directions, the problem became acute. Napoleon was brilliant at concentrating forces, at choosing the decisive point and bringing overwhelming power to bear. But when there were multiple fronts, when the enemies were coordinated and he couldn't be at all the crucial battles simultaneously, the system broke down. His marshals won some battles, lost others, but they were fighting separate campaigns, not a coherent strategy, because there was no mechanism for them to coordinate except through him. And he was overwhelmed, making too many decisions, trying to manage too much, missing things that would have been obvious if he had built a command structure that could function without his constant direction. At Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered, not because his forces were incompetent, but because the coalition had learned to coordinate, to move together, to create situations where his genius for battlefield tactics couldn't compensate for strategic disadvantages. And he had no institutional response. No system that could operate at that level of complexity without him at the center. After Leipzig, the retreat to France, the final campaigns, they showed the same pattern. Brilliant tactical victories that didn't add up to strategic success. Because one person, however capable, can't run a war on multiple fronts, can't make every decision, can't be the only source of coordination and strategic direction. The tragedy is that he had capable people. His marshals weren't incompetent. They had won battles all over Europe, but they had been trained as executors, as instruments of his will, not as independent commanders, not as strategic thinkers in their own right. And when the situation required them to be more than that, they struggled. And this wasn't their failure. It was his, the predictable outcome of a system built on distrust, of a command structure designed to ensure no one could act without his approval, of a lifetime spent believing that delegation was risk and control was safety. Some of his marshals saw it, tried to tell him, suggested that he needed to delegate more, to trust his commanders, to build a system that could sustain the empire even when he couldn't personally oversee everything. And he couldn't do it, couldn't make that shift, couldn't believe that letting go of control wouldn't immediately result in betrayal or incompetence. So the system stayed centralized, stayed dependent on him, stayed vulnerable to the inevitable reality that one person has limits, physical limits, cognitive limits, strategic limits that no amount of brilliance can overcome. By Waterloo, the final battle, the pattern was complete. He made tactical mistakes, delayed decisions, trusted Grouchy to intercept the Prussians without giving him clear enough orders. The genius that had won dozens of battles was still there, but it was operating in a system that had become too complex, too fragile, too dependent on things going exactly right. And when they didn't, when luck went against him, when the Prussians arrived before Grouchy could stop them, there was no backup, no resilient system, no institutional capacity to absorb the shock and adapt. Just catastrophic failure, immediate, decisive, final. His distrust had protected him, had helped him rise, had enabled extraordinary achievements. And then, at the crucial moment when he needed something different, when he needed the capacity to delegate and trust and build institutions that could function without him, it failed him. Because you can't build that kind of system overnight. Can't suddenly start trusting people after a lifetime of surveillance and control. Can't develop institutional resilience when you've spent decades ensuring that all real authority flows through you personally. The weakness was baked in, present from the beginning, invisible when things were going well, when his personal capabilities were sufficient, when the challenges were at a scale he could manage, but guaranteed to become fatal the moment the empire exceeded what one person could handle, the moment trust and delegation stopped being optional and became necessary. And by then, it was too late to change, too late to build what should have been built years earlier, too late to develop the relationships and institutions and distributed authority that might have sustained what he had created. The distrust that had been his strength became his undoing, and the pattern held to the end. By 1814, Napoleon was making decisions in a vacuum, not literally alone. He still had advisors, ministers, marshals, a court, all the apparatus of empire. But the quality of information reaching him had degraded. The honest assessments had stopped. The pushback that might have corrected his thinking had disappeared. This happens with isolated leaders. The people around them learn what gets rewarded and what gets punished. They learn that disagreement is dangerous, that bringing bad news results in being blamed for the news, that the safest path is to agree, to confirm what the leader already believes, to avoid being the one who tells them they're wrong. Napoleon's advisors knew he didn't trust them, knew their positions were contingent, knew he was monitoring them, surveilling them, ready to replace them at any sign of disloyalty or incompetence. So they adapted, became cautious, told him what he wanted to hear, or at least avoided telling him what he didn't want to hear. When Talleyrand tried to warn him about overextension, about the danger of fighting too many enemies simultaneously, Napoleon dismissed him, eventually sidelined him. The message was clear. Strategic dissent wasn't welcome. Tactical implementation was your job. Strategic thinking was his. When his marshals expressed doubts about the Russian campaign, he overruled them. When they suggested different approaches in Spain, he ignored them. When they counseled peace after Leipzig, after it was clear the military situation was deteriorating, he rejected their advice. And they learned, stopped offering opinions, stopped pushing back, just executed orders, waited to see how things played out. And when things played out badly, when the situation became obviously unsustainable, they started thinking about their own survival rather than his success. This is what isolation does. It doesn't just cut you off from people. It cuts you off from information, from honest feedback, from the reality checking that prevents catastrophic mistakes. You end up making decisions based on incomplete information, based on your own assumptions, based on a model of the world that nobody is testing or challenging. By late 1813, Napoleon's assessment of the military situation was disconnected from reality. He believed he could still win, still reverse the momentum, still fight off the coalition through sheer tactical brilliance and force of will. His marshals knew better, could see that the numbers didn't work, that the resources weren't there, that France was exhausted and the enemies were coordinated and no amount of brilliant maneuvering could overcome the fundamental imbalance. But they didn't tell him, or they told him carefully, diplomatically, in ways that could be ignored, because they had learned that direct contradiction was dangerous, that Napoleon didn't want to hear about limitations, about things that couldn't be done. He wanted solutions, action, victory, not explanations of why victory was impossible. So the decisions got worse, more disconnected from reality, more based on what he wanted to be true rather than what was actually true. He kept fighting when negotiation might have preserved something, kept refusing reasonable peace terms because he couldn't accept a diminished position, couldn't imagine France without him at the center, couldn't distinguish between his personal position and the nation's interests. And his former allies, the people who had supported him for years, started making other arrangements. Talleyrand negotiated with the coalition. Fouché prepared for the restoration. The marshals positioned themselves to survive the transition, not because they were uniquely disloyal, but because they could see what was coming and he couldn't, or wouldn't, because accepting it would have required accepting that he had been wrong, that the system he built was failing, that the distrust that had protected him had also isolated him, that control without trust had limits, that one person, however brilliant, couldn't sustain an empire through pure force of will. His final attempt at a comeback, the 100 days between his escape from Elba and Waterloo, showed the pattern in its final form. He still had supporters, still had some loyalty, but the institutional foundation was gone. The coalition was prepared. The European powers were united against him in a way they hadn't been before. And he still made the same mistakes, still centralized decision-making, still refused to fully trust his subordinates, still operated as if personal tactical brilliance could overcome strategic disadvantages. The genius was still there, but it was operating in an impossible situation, against enemies who had learned how to fight him, in a context where his strengths couldn't compensate for his weaknesses. At Waterloo, Grouchy's failure to intercept the Prussians was critical. But Grouchy failed partly because Napoleon's orders were unclear, partly because Grouchy had never been trained to think strategically, partly because the command structure didn't support the kind of initiative and coordination that the situation required. And when the Prussians arrived, when the battle turned, when the Imperial Guard broke for the first time in its history, there was no resilient system underneath, no institutional capacity to absorb the defeat and regroup, just immediate collapse, complete, irreversible, final. The isolation that had been building for years became complete on St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic. A handful of followers, British guards, no power, no empire, no decisions to make that mattered. Just time, years of time, to write, to dictate memoirs, to shape the legend, to justify, to explain, to try to control how history would remember him. And he was alone there in a way that was different from the functional isolation of his years in power. Before, he had been alone by choice, by design, by the conviction that trust was dangerous. Now he was alone because there was nothing left. No empire to run, no battles to fight, no decisions to make. Just existence, diminished, circumscribed, finished. He died there, on May 5, 1821, possibly from stomach cancer, possibly from arsenic poisoning, possibly from the accumulated stress and trauma of a life lived at that intensity. The cause is uncertain. The outcome isn't. The man who had controlled an empire, who had never trusted anyone, who had built everything on his own shoulders, died isolated on a remote island, remembered but not mourned by the people who had served him, respected but not loved, admired for his achievements but not for his character. The cost of isolation isn't just loneliness. It's the accumulation of small distortions, of feedback loops that reinforce error, of systems that work until they don't and then collapse completely because there's no resilience.
No distributed capability.
No one who can step in when the center fails. Napoleon built something extraordinary, and he built it in a way that guaranteed it couldn't last, couldn't survive his absence, couldn't adapt when the world changed, because he never learned that some kinds of strength require vulnerability, that some kinds of success require trust, that control has limits and isolation has costs, and one person, however brilliant, cannot sustain an empire alone. So was Napoleon right? Was his distrust justified? Did it protect him? Did it enable his rise and simply become obsolete at a certain scale? Or was it always a weakness, just one that didn't show until the challenges exceeded what one person could manage? The honest answer is both. It was appropriate for the world that formed him, for revolutionary France where trust was literally dangerous, where alliances shifted constantly, where yesterday's ally was today's enemy. In that context, his instincts were correct. The people who trusted too easily didn't survive. He did, and those same instincts helped him build an empire, helped him maintain control, helped him prevent the kind of internal fragmentation that destroyed other revolutionary governments. The centralization, the surveillance, the refusal to delegate real authority. It all worked, for a while. But there's a difference between what helps you survive a crisis and what helps you build something sustainable. Between the skills you need to seize power and the skills you need to maintain it. Between tactics that work at one scale and structures that work at another. Napoleon never made that transition, never learned to distinguish between appropriate caution and pathological distrust, never developed the ability to delegate meaningfully, never built institutions that could function without him. And that wasn't because the people around him were untrustworthy. It was because his entire model of how power and relationships work was based on the assumption that trust is weakness. The question isn't whether he was wrong to distrust specific people. Some of them did betray him. Some were working their own agendas. His suspicion was often justified by the facts. The question is whether that justified never learning to trust, never building relationships based on something other than control, never developing systems that could function without his constant oversight. And the answer, judging by outcomes, is no. The empire fell. The institutions collapsed. The relationships dissolved. What he built didn't survive him because he built it in a way that depended entirely on him, on his personal capabilities, on his constant presence and attention and decision-making. There's a pattern here that extends beyond Napoleon, beyond his specific circumstances. It's about what happens when capable people convince themselves that they can't rely on others. That delegation is risk. That trust is vulnerability. That the only safe position is total control. You see it in organizations, in companies where the founder can't let go, can't build a team that can operate without them, can't create institutional knowledge or distributed authority. The company grows to a certain point, hits a ceiling, starts to fail not because the founder isn't capable, but because the challenges have become too complex for one person to manage. You see it in governments, leaders who centralize power, who undermine institutions, who replace competent people with loyalists, who create systems where all decisions flow through them. Feels like strength, like control, like safety, but it's brittle, fragile, vulnerable to the inevitable moment when the leader can't be everywhere, can't make every decision, can't handle the complexity. You see it in personal relationships, people who can't be vulnerable, who can't share burdens, who manage instead of connecting, who control instead of trusting. The relationships function, serve purposes, but they never go deep, never become real partnerships, never provide the kind of support and connection that makes difficult things sustainable. The cost is always the same: isolation, the inability to build anything that doesn't rest entirely on your own shoulders, the absence of genuine collaboration, the lack of resilience when things go wrong, and eventually the collapse, because nothing built entirely on one person's capabilities can survive indefinitely. Napoleon's story is extreme. The scale was extraordinary. The stakes were enormous. The consequences were historic. But the pattern is universal. The dynamic is recognizable. The cautionary tale is relevant, because the question he faced is one that capable people face constantly. When is it safe to trust? When can you delegate? When can you let go of control without everything falling apart? And the answer he found, never or almost never, was wrong. Understandably wrong. Shaped by real experiences in a genuinely dangerous world. But wrong nonetheless. The right answer, the one he never found, is harder. It requires distinguishing between justified caution and pathological distrust, between appropriate verification and controlling surveillance, between delegation that empowers and abdication that abandons. It requires building systems and relationships and institutions that can function without constant intervention, that can absorb mistakes and adapt and continue even when you're not there to manage every detail. It requires trust, not blind trust, not naive trust, but calibrated trust. Trust that's tested and verified but still genuine. Trust that creates the possibility of being disappointed but also creates the possibility of building something larger than yourself. Something that can survive beyond your personal involvement. Something resilient. Napoleon never learned to do that. Never developed the capacity for that kind of trust. And the empire that resulted was magnificent, historically significant, transformative, and temporary, fragile, doomed to collapse the moment his personal capabilities were insufficient to sustain it. The tragedy isn't that he failed. It's that he succeeded as much as he did while carrying this fundamental limitation. That he built so much while being so isolated. That he achieved so much while trusting so little. And that the limitation that protected him in the beginning ensured his fall in the end. That's the lesson. Not that trust is always safe, but that distrust, even when justified, has costs. That control, even when effective, has limits. That isolation, even when protective, prevents the kind of collaboration and institutional building that makes achievements sustainable. Napoleon never trusted anyone, and in the short term, it worked. In the long term, it guaranteed failure. The question for anyone in a position of power or responsibility is, which time frame matters? What are you trying to build? And what are you willing to risk to make it last?